John Harper had always been a dreamer. Ever since he was a child, he loved the idea of growing his own food. There was something magical about planting a tiny seed in the ground, watering it, and watching it grow into something that could feed him and his family. It wasn't just about the vegetables, it was about the connection to nature, the satisfaction of hard work paying off, and the sense of independence that came with living off the land. For years, John worked tirelessly at his desk job, saving every penny he could so he could one day buy a house where he could turn this dream into reality. Finally, after decades of patience and planning, John found the perfect place, a modest home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house itself wasn't anything fancy, but it had a spacious backyard that caught his eye immediately. It was flat, sunny, and full of potential. John wasted no time getting to work. Within weeks, he had transformed the empty patch of dirt into a thriving vegetable garden. Rows of tomatoes stretched out under the sun, their bright red fruits glistening like jewels. Cucumbers climbed trellises, while peppers in shades of green, yellow, and red added bursts of color. Herbs like basil, mint, and rosemary filled the air with their fresh, earthy scents. Every morning, John would step outside with a cup of coffee in hand, taking a moment to admire the life he had created. It didn't take long for neighbors to notice John's garden. At first, they were curious. Some would stop by during their evening walks to ask questions or simply marvel at how lush and vibrant everything looked. "You've got quite the green thumb," one neighbor remarked as she bent down to examine a particularly large tomato. Another stopped by to compliment the neat rows and tidy organization. Word spread quickly, and soon, John became known as the gardener of the neighborhood. People admired not only his skill, but also his generosity. He often shared baskets of fresh produce with those who expressed interest. Kids loved visiting his garden too, fascinated by the sight of bees buzzing around flowers and worms wriggling in the soil. John even taught a few of them how to plant seeds, sparking a love for gardening in the younger generation. But not everyone felt the same way about John's project. While many appreciated the beauty and effort behind his garden, others saw it differently. In this neighborhood, appearances mattered a lot. The community was governed by a homeowners association, HOA, an organization responsible for maintaining certain standards across the area. These standards included rules about what kinds of plants residents could grow, how lawns should look, and even the colors people could paint their houses. Most homeowners followed these guidelines without complaint, valuing the uniformity and order they brought to the neighborhood. Manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and carefully arranged flower beds were the norm here. To some, John's garden stood out like a sore thumb. At first, the complaints were subtle. A neighbor might mention casually that the tall tomato plants blocked their view slightly. Another might joke about how messy the garden looked compared to the perfectly groomed yards nearby. But as more people began voicing their opinions, the criticism grew louder. One evening, John overheard two women chatting near his fence. "I mean, I get that he's trying to be self-sufficient and all," one said, "but doesn't it look untidy? Like, why can't he just stick to flowers or something?" The other nodded in agreement. "Exactly. It's ruining the whole vibe of the street." John tried not to let these comments bother him. After all, he knew his garden wasn't hurting anyone. If anything, it was helping, providing fresh, healthy food, and creating a space where neighbors could connect with nature. Still, he couldn't ignore the growing tension. He started noticing sideways glances when he watered his plants or harvested vegetables. Conversations with some neighbors became awkward, almost forced. Even the compliments he used to receive dwindled. It seemed like the more success his garden enjoyed, the more resentment it stirred among certain members of the community. Despite the mounting pressure, John refused to give up. Gardening wasn't just a hobby for him, it was a passion, a way of life. He believed deeply in the importance of sustainability and self-reliance, values he hoped to pass on to his children. Every time he pulled weeds or tended to his crops, he reminded himself why he started this journey in the first place. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was brewing. Little did he know, the HOA was already discussing his garden behind closed doors, debating whether it violated their strict rules about property aesthetics. And soon, John would find himself facing a challenge unlike any he'd encountered before. As days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder. Complaints about John's garden made their way to the monthly HOA meetings, where board members took turns expressing their concerns. Some argued that the garden disrupted the neighborhood's cohesive appearance, while others claimed it attracted pests like insects and rodents. Though no formal action had been taken yet, John sensed that something was coming. His peaceful morning spent tending to his plants now carried an undertone of unease, as if a storm cloud loomed just beyond the horizon. Unbeknownst to him, that storm was closer than he realized, and it would strike sooner than expected. John Harper wasn't the type to give up easily. Sure, the HOA had thrown him a curveball by fencing off his garden, but he wasn't about to let them win. As days turned into weeks, John spent every spare moment researching ways to fight back. He knew he couldn't take on the HOA directly. They had rules, lawyers, and resources on their side. But what if he could outsmart them? What if there was a way to turn their own actions against them? That's when he stumbled upon something that changed everything. While combing through property records online, John discovered an interesting detail about the fence surrounding his garden. The wooden structure itself wasn't the issue. It was the gate. Specifically, the lot where the gate stood. Most of the fence lined the edges of his backyard, which technically fell under his property or the HOA's jurisdiction. But the gate? It sat on a tiny parcel of land owned not by the HOA or any homeowner. It belonged to the original developer who had built the neighborhood years ago. This sliver of land, barely large enough for the gate and its frame, had never been sold or transferred because it was too awkwardly shaped and inconveniently located. And now, incredibly, it was still listed for sale. At first, John thought it was too good to be true. Could this really be the loophole he needed? If he bought the lot, with the gate, he'd effectively control access to the fenced-off area containing his garden. No one, not even the HOA, could enter without his permission. It was a bold, almost audacious idea, but John decided it was worth a shot. After all, what did he have to lose? The next morning, John called the real estate agent handling the sale of the lot. When she answered, he explained his interest in buying the property. At first, she sounded skeptical. "Are you sure?" she asked. "It's such a small piece of land. Most people don't see much value in it." John chuckled nervously. "Oh, I see plenty of value," he replied. "Trust me, this is exactly what I'm looking for." After some back-and-forth negotiations, John made an offer. To his relief, and slight disbelief, the developer accepted. Within days, the paperwork was finalized, and John officially became the proud owner of the tiniest, most strategic plot of land in the entire neighborhood. He held the deed in his hands, feeling a mix of triumph and anticipation. He hadn't won the battle yet, but he'd just gained a powerful weapon. With ownership of the gate lot secured, John wasted no time putting his plan into action. The first thing he did was install a sturdy lock on the gate. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple padlock, but it served its purpose. No one could open the gate without the key. And guess who had the only copy? John grinned as he slipped the key onto his keychain, knowing full well the chaos this would unleash. Word spread quickly around the neighborhood. Neighbors noticed the new lock almost immediately and began speculating about its meaning. Some assumed it was part of the HOA's ongoing efforts to maintain control over John's garden. Others wondered if John himself had taken matters into his own hands. Either way, curiosity turned to outrage when people realized what had happened. The HOA, which had prided itself on maintaining order, suddenly found itself locked out of the very space it had tried to regulate. When Mr. Peterson, the HOA president, heard about the situation, he was livid. He called an emergency meeting to address the gate crisis, as some residents were calling it. Board members gathered in the Isabin Community Center, their faces flushed with frustration. "This is unacceptable," Mr. Peterson exclaimed, slamming his fist on the table. "Harper has gone too far. He can't just buy a piece of land and lock us out." "Well, legally he can, interjected Ms. Carter, the board's lawyer. She adjusted her glasses and flipped through a stack of documents. According to property law, Harper owns that lot fair and square. Unless we can prove he's violating zoning regulations or causing harm, there's not much we can do. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. They had underestimated John, assuming he would accept their decision and move on. Instead, he had turned the tables, using their own tactics against them. For the first time, the HOA found itself on the defensive. Meanwhile, John braced himself for the backlash. He knew owning the gate lot wouldn't sit well with everyone, especially those who supported the HOA's strict rules. Sure enough, neighbors started confronting him during walks or at the mailbox. "Why are you doing this, John?" one woman demanded. "You're being petty. All you had to do was follow the rules." John sighed, keeping his cool. "I'm not being petty," he replied. "I'm standing up for something I believe in. My garden isn't just a hobby, it's a way of life. If the HOA wants to shut it down, fine, but they'll have to deal with the consequences." Others weren't so diplomatic. A few neighbors accused John of ruining the neighborhood's harmony. One man even threatened to report him to local authorities, claiming he was creating a public nuisance. Despite the hostility, John refused to back down. He reminded himself why he'd started this fight in the first place. His garden represented more than just vegetables. It symbolized resilience, creativity, and the power of thinking outside the box. As tensions escalated, the HOA scrambled to find a solution. They reached out to John multiple times, proposing various compromises. At one point, they offered to remove the fence entirely if he agreed to sell the gate lot back to them. Another time, they suggested installing a second gate elsewhere, bypassing his property altogether. But John rejected each proposal, knowing they were merely band-aid fixes designed to restore the status quo. He wanted real change, a guarantee that his garden, and others like it, would be protected moving forward. Finally, the HOA resorted to negotiation. In a last-ditch effort to resolve the standoff, they invited John to another meeting. This time, however, the tone was different. Gone were the dismissive remarks and rigid posturing. Instead, the board members seemed genuinely interested in finding common ground. Mr. Peterson opened the discussion with a conciliatory statement. "Mr. Harper, we recognize your commitment to sustainability and self-reliance. Perhaps there's a way we can work together to accommodate gardens like yours while preserving the neighborhood's overall aesthetic." John listened carefully, weighing their words. He appreciated the olive branch, but he also knew better than to trust empty promises. "I'm willing to consider your ideas," he said slowly, "but only if you agree to amend the HOA guidelines to explicitly allow gardening activities. Anything less, and we're back to square one." The board hesitated, clearly uneasy about revising their cherished rules, but they had no choice. Public opinion was shifting, thanks in part to media coverage of the gate controversy. Local news outlets picked up the story, portraying John as a modern-day David taking on the Goliath of suburban bureaucracy. Supporters rallied behind him, praising his ingenuity and determination. Even some skeptical neighbors admitted they admired his boldness. Faced with mounting pressure, the HOA reluctantly agreed to John's terms. By the end of the meeting, both sides had reached a tentative agreement. The HOA promised to draft new policies that would permit sustainable gardening practices, provided certain conditions were met, such as keeping gardens tidy and avoiding invasive plants. In return, John agreed to unlock the gate and cooperate with future inspections. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. As John walked home that evening, he felt a sense of cautious optimism. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, change rarely was, but he had proven that persistence and creativity could overcome even the most stubborn obstacles. The HOA might have fenced off his garden, but they hadn't counted on John buying the gate lot with the only key. And in doing so, he had planted the seeds of a much larger movement, one that would inspire others to rethink what it meant to live sustainably in a suburban world. The morning air was crisp and cool, The kind that made John want to grab a cup of coffee and step outside to enjoy the quiet before the day began. But as he opened his front door, something felt off. The usual rustle of leaves and chirping birds seemed muted, replaced by an eerie stillness. His eyes scanned the yard, searching for what had changed. Then it hit him. His heart sank like a stone dropped into deep water. There, surrounding his once open garden, stood a tall wooden fence. It loomed over the rows of vegetables like a prison wall, blocking out sunlight and cutting off access to the very space he had poured his soul into. John blinked, thinking maybe he was imagining things. Perhaps this was some strange prank or a bizarre dream. But no, the fence was real. Solid. Planks of wood stretched from one end of his backyard to the other, completely enclosing his garden. He rushed toward it, running his hands along the rough surface, his mind racing with questions. Who had done this? When? And why? It didn't take long for John to piece together what had happened. As he walked around the perimeter, he noticed fresh tire tracks in the dirt and discarded tools lying nearby. Clearly, construction workers had been here overnight, likely hired by the HOA. They hadn't even bothered to notify him. They just came in under the cover of darkness and built the fence without permission. Anger bubbled inside him, mixing with disbelief. How could they do this? This wasn't just a patch of land. It was his garden, his hard work, his pride. John stormed back into the house, grabbed his phone, and dialed the number for the HOA office. After several rings, a polite but detached voice answered. "Good morning, how can I assist you?" John struggled to keep his tone calm as he explained what he'd found. "Someone put up a fence around my garden last night," he said through gritted teeth. "I need answers. Now." The woman on the other end hesitated briefly before confirming his worst fears. Yes, the HOA had authorized the fence. No, they hadn't consulted him beforehand. And yes, it was entirely within their rights according to the community guidelines. Fuming, John demanded to speak to someone higher up. A few minutes later, he was transferred to Mr. Peterson, the president of the HOA board. Mr. Peterson's voice was smooth and measured, almost rehearsed, as if he'd anticipated this conversation. "Mr. Harper," he began, "we understand your frustration, but we must enforce the standards set forth by our association. Your garden, while admirable, doesn't align with the aesthetic expectations of the neighborhood." "Aesthetic expectations?" John repeated, his voice rising. "You mean manicured lawns and fake flowers? My garden provides food, not just decoration. It's sustainable, healthy, and educational." Mr. Peterson sighed audibly. "I sympathize with your position truly. However, rules are rules. We've received numerous complaints about the appearance of your property, and action needed to be taken." The call ended abruptly after that, leaving John feeling both furious and powerless. Complaints? From whom? Surely not everyone disliked his garden. He knew plenty of neighbors who appreciated it, but evidently there were enough dissenting voices to sway the HOA's decision. For the rest of the day, John paced back and forth in his living room, replaying the conversation in his head. Every time he looked out the window at the looming fence, his stomach churned. This wasn't fair. It wasn't right. And he wasn't going to let it stand. The following week, John attended the monthly HOA meeting, determined to fight for his garden. He arrived early, clutching a folder filled with notes, photos, and research he'd gathered to support his case. Inside the small community center, chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a podium where the board members sat. Most attendees were older residents, dressed casually but neatly, sipping coffee and chatting quietly. When John entered, heads turned, and whispers rippled through the room. Some people avoided his gaze altogether, while others offered sympathetic smiles. He took a seat near the front, steeling himself for the battle ahead. When it was finally his turn to speak, John stood up and approached the podium. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "Thank you for allowing me to address the board today," he began. "As many of you know, I've spent countless hours cultivating a garden in my backyard, It's more than just plants. It's a source of joy, nutrition, and education for my family and neighbors. Recently, however, you erected a fence around here without consulting me. This fence is not only unnecessary but actively harmful. It blocks sunlight, which is essential for plant growth, and cuts off access to something I worked incredibly hard to build. He paused, scanning the faces of the board members. Their expressions ranged from impassive to mildly irritated. Undeterred, John continued. I understand the importance of maintaining a cohesive appearance in our neighborhood, but isn't there room for compromise? Why can't we find a way to balance beauty with functionality? My garden benefits everyone. It encourages sustainability, reduces waste, and fosters a sense of community. Instead of tearing it down or hiding it away, why not celebrate it? For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then Mr. Peterson leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. Mr. Harper, we appreciate your passion, he said slowly. However, the rules exist for a reason. Uniformity ensures property values remain high, and the neighborhood stays appealing to potential buyers. Allowing exceptions creates a slippery slope. If we permit one resident to deviate from the guidelines, others will expect the same leniency. John clenched his jaw, biting back a retort. He wanted to argue that property values weren't everything, that quality of life mattered too, but he knew it wouldn't change their minds. The board was unmoved, unwilling to budge even an inch. As the meeting dragged on, other residents voiced their opinions. Some sided with John, praising his creativity and dedication. Others echoed the board's stance, insisting that rules were meant to be followed. By the time the session ended, John felt drained and defeated. The HOA had made its position crystal clear. The fence was staying, and there was nothing he could do about it. Driving home that evening, John replayed the meeting in his mind. He thought about the dismissive looks, the condescending remarks, the sheer lack of empathy. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about principle. They had treated him like a nuisance, like his dreams and efforts didn't matter. Well, he wasn't going to roll over and accept defeat. Not this time. As he pulled into his driveway and stared at the fence blocking his garden, an idea began to form. Maybe he couldn't tear the fence down. Maybe he couldn't change the HOA's mind. But perhaps there was another way. A clever, unexpected solution that would give him the upper hand. John smiled faintly, a spark of determination igniting within him. The HOA thought they'd won, but they had no idea what he was capable of. Over the next few days, John threw himself into research. He scoured online forums, legal documents, and local records, determined to find any loophole or advantage he could use. His focus shifted from despair to strategy. What started as a personal battle against bureaucracy transformed into a game of wits, and John intended to play to win. Little did the HOA know, their decision to fence off his garden had awakened a side of John they hadn't anticipated, one that was resourceful, relentless, and ready to turn the tables in the most unexpected way possible. The days following the HOA's agreement to revise their policies were tense but hopeful. John Harper knew that while progress had been made, the battle wasn't over yet. The HOA still had to draft and approve the new guidelines, a process that could take weeks or even months. In the meantime, the gate remained locked, serving as both a symbol of John's defiance and a reminder of the unresolved tension between him and the neighborhood leadership. But John was patient. He understood that real change took time, and he wasn't about to rush things now when so much was at stake. Word of the standoff continued to spread beyond the confines of the suburban neighborhood. Local newspapers ran stories about the gardener who outsmarted the HOA, highlighting John's clever purchase of the gate lot and his refusal to back down. Social media buzzed with reactions, ranging from admiration to outrage. Some people praised John for standing up against what they saw as an overly controlling organization. Others criticized him, accusing him of being selfish or causing unnecessary drama. Despite the mixed opinions, one thing was clear. John's story had struck a nerve. It tapped into broader conversations about individual rights versus community rules, sustainability, and the growing desire for self-sufficiency in modern life. Inspired by the attention, local TV stations sent reporters to interview John. 1. Sunny afternoon. A camera crew arrived at his house, setting up tripods and microphones in his driveway. Neighbors gathered curiously on the sidewalk, whispering among themselves as the interview began. The reporter, a cheerful woman named Lisa, asked John how he felt about becoming an accidental hero. "I didn't set out to make waves," John said honestly, adjusting his hat against the glare of the sun. "All I wanted was to grow food for my family and share it with my neighbors. When the HOA put up that fence, they weren't just blocking my garden. They were stifling something bigger, something important. So yeah, maybe I got creative. Maybe I pushed back harder than they expected. But sometimes you have to stand your ground to protect what matters." His words resonated deeply with viewers. Clips of the interview aired on the evening news, sparking heated debates online and offline. People started sharing photos of their own gardens, tagging posts with hashtags like #UnGardensOverGates and Stand with John. What had begun as a personal dispute in a quiet suburban neighborhood had morphed into a rallying cry for anyone who believed in the power of grassroots activism and sustainable living. Back in the community, reactions were mixed. Some neighbors, emboldened by John's success, began questioning the HOA's authority more openly. A small group of residents formed a committee to advocate for greener practices within the neighborhood, proposing ideas like communal gardens, composting programs, and native plant landscaping. Others, however, doubled down on their opposition to John's methods. They argued that his actions disrupted the peace and harmony of the area, making it harder for everyone to coexist peacefully. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. The HOA, meanwhile, found itself caught between two factions. On one side were those demanding stricter enforcement of the existing rules. On the other were supporters of reform who viewed John's victory as an opportunity to modernize the association's outdated policies. Board meetings became increasingly contentious, with members shouting over each other and storming out in frustration. Mr. Peterson, the president of the HOA, tried to maintain order, but even he struggled to keep the peace. Privately, he admitted to colleagues that the situation had spiraled far beyond what anyone had anticipated. "We underestimated Harper," he confessed during a closed-door session. "He's smarter than we gave him credit for, and now we're paying the price." Despite the chaos, John stayed focused on his goal. He worked closely with Ms. Carter, the HOA's lawyer, to ensure the new gardening guidelines were fair and enforceable. Together, they crafted language that allowed homeowners to cultivate vegetable gardens, provided they adhered to certain standards. For example, gardens couldn't obstruct sidewalks or block views, and plants had to be contained within designated areas. Additionally, the revised policy encouraged eco-friendly practices like rainwater harvesting and pollinator-friendly flowers. While some board members grumbled about these concessions, most recognized that compromise was necessary to restore balance and avoid further bad press. Finally, after weeks of deliberation, the HOA announced its decision. At a special meeting held in the community center, Mr. Peterson stood before a packed room of residents and read the updated guidelines aloud. As he spoke, John sat quietly in the front row, listening intently. When the presentation ended, applause erupted from supporters while opponents crossed their arms and muttered under their breath. Though not everyone was happy, the majority seemed willing to give the new rules a chance. With the policy officially changed, John unlocked the gate for the first time in months. He invited his neighbors to come see the garden he'd fought so hard to save. Dozens showed up, curious to witness the source of all the commotion. As they stepped through the gate, many were surprised by what they saw. Despite being fenced off and neglected for weeks, the garden was thriving. Tomatoes hung, heavy on their vines. Herbs released their fragrant aromas and flowers bloomed in vibrant colors. Children darted between the rows, marveling at the bees buzzing around blossoms, while adults snapped photos and asked questions about planting techniques. One neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, approached John with tears in her eyes. "I'll admit, I was skeptical at first," she said softly. But seeing this, it makes me realize how wrong I was. Your garden isn't just beautiful. It's inspiring. Thank you for sticking to your guns." John smiled, touched by her words. "It's not just my garden anymore," he replied. "It belongs to all of us. Let's work together to make our neighborhood better, not just prettier." In the weeks that followed, the transformation was remarkable. Inspired by John's example, several families converted parts of their lawns into gardens. Some collaborated on shared plots, pooling resources and knowledge. Others joined the newly formed Sustainability Committee, brainstorming ways to reduce waste and conserve energy throughout the community. Even the HOA softened its stance, hosting workshops on topics like organic farming and water conservation. Slowly but surely, the neighborhood began to embrace a new identity, one rooted in cooperation, creativity, and environmental stewardship. Looking back, John realized that buying the gate lot had been more than just a tactical move. It had been a catalyst for change. By refusing to back down, he had forced his neighbors to confront uncomfortable truths about conformity, freedom, and the kind of world they wanted to live in. His garden had become a symbol of resilience, proving that even in the face of adversity, it was possible to grow something meaningful. And as he stood amidst the flourishing plants, watching children laugh and neighbors chat, John knew he had planted seeds that would continue to sprout for generations to come. Years passed, and the neighborhood that once stood divided over a garden transformed into something entirely different. John Harper's fight against the HOA became legend, a story told at community gatherings, shared among newcomers, and even referenced in local newspapers as an example of grassroots activism done right. What started as a personal battle for his garden had grown into a movement that reshaped not just one neighborhood, but inspired countless others to rethink their relationship with nature, sustainability, and community. The once pristine lawns that defined the area were now dotted with vegetable patches, fruit trees, and pollinator-friendly flowers. Neighbors who had once argued about aesthetics found common ground in tending to shared gardens or swapping produce at weekend markets. The HOA, which had initially resisted change, evolved into a more progressive organization. They began hosting annual events like Green Day, where residents could learn about composting, rainwater harvesting, and urban gardening. Even Mr. Peterson, the former president of the HOA, admitted during a speech at one such event that John's persistence had been a wake-up call. "Sometimes," he said with a smile, "you need someone to challenge the status quo to remind you what truly matters." John himself became a beloved figure in the community. No longer seen as a troublemaker, he was now regarded as a visionary, a man whose determination had sparked positive change. People often stopped by his house to ask for gardening tips or simply to chat. Kids loved visiting his backyard, where they learned how to plant seeds, care for plants, and appreciate the wonders of nature. Some of them even started their own mini gardens at home, proudly showing off their progress to John whenever they saw him. But it wasn't just the physical landscape of the neighborhood that changed. Attitudes shifted too. Conversations around dinner tables and at block parties frequently turned to topics like sustainability, self-sufficiency, and the importance of standing up for your beliefs. Residents realized that while rules served a purpose, they shouldn't come at the cost of individuality or innovation. John's story taught them that sometimes breaking free from rigid expectations could lead to unexpected beauty and unity. One of the most heartwarming developments came when the neighborhood decided to honor John's contributions in a tangible way. During a special ceremony held on Earth Day, they unveiled a plaque near the entrance to the community. It read, "In gratitude to John Harper, whose courage and creativity inspired us all to grow, not just gardens, but stronger connections, healthier lives, and a brighter future." Standing before a crowd of cheering neighbors, John felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't fought this battle for recognition, but seeing the impact of his actions filled him with pride. As time went on, John continued to nurture his garden, though it no longer required the same level of vigilance. With the HOA's revised policies firmly in place, he no longer worried about fences or locked gates. Instead, he focused on expanding his efforts, experimenting with new crops and techniques, and mentoring others who wanted to follow in his footsteps. His backyard became a hub of activity, hosting workshops, school field trips, and even small festivals celebrating the harvest season. Yet, despite all the accolades and admiration, John remained humble. He knew that his success wasn't solely his own. It belonged to everyone who had supported him along the way. From the neighbors who rallied behind him, to the reporters who amplified his cause, each person played a role in creating lasting change. And while he cherished the memories of those early days of defiance, he also looked forward to what lay ahead. Eventually, John's influence extended beyond the confines of his neighborhood. Local schools invited him to speak to students about sustainability and resilience. Community organizations sought his advice on starting urban gardening initiatives. Even nearby neighborhoods reached out, asking how they could replicate the transformation he'd helped spark. John embraced these opportunities, eager to share his knowledge and inspire others to take action in their own communities. Perhaps the most profound legacy of John's journey, however, was the shift in mindset. It fostered. People began to see their yards not as spaces to conform to arbitrary standards, but as canvases for creativity and connection. Gardens sprouted everywhere, in front yards, on rooftops, and even in abandoned lots. These green spaces didn't just provide food. They brought people together, fostering conversations and friendships that might never have happened otherwise. On sunny afternoons, John would sit on his porch, sipping tea and watching the world unfold before him. Children played tag between rows of sunflowers, while adults exchanged recipes made from freshly picked vegetables. Birds chirped overhead, and the scent of blooming lavender drifted through the air. It was a scene straight out of his childhood. Dreams, a harmonious blend of nature, community, and purpose. Though he rarely spoke of it, John often reflected on the lessons he'd learned throughout his journey. He realized that fighting for what you believe in isn't always easy. It takes courage, patience, and unwavering conviction. But he also understood that true change requires more than just resistance. It demands collaboration, empathy, and a willingness to listen. By standing firm yet open-minded, he had managed to turn conflict into opportunity, division into unity, and frustration into inspiration. When asked by a young neighbor one day why he cared so much about gardening, John smiled thoughtfully before answering. "It's not just about growing food," he said. "It's about planting seeds, for hope, for connection, for a better tomorrow. Every plant starts small, but with care and time, it can grow into something amazing. That's what I've tried to do here with my garden, with this neighborhood, and with all of you." And as the years rolled on, those seeds continued to flourish. John's story lived on, passed down from generation to generation, reminding everyone who heard it that sometimes the smallest acts of rebellion can lead to the biggest transformations. In a world often driven by conformity, John Harper proved that thinking outside the box and daring to dream differently could create a legacy far greater than anyone imagined.